A little bit of housekeeping from last week. The outline that you guys had, I apologize. I guess some of you had on the back side didn't print out. So hopefully you use that blank side to take notes. But for some reason, some of them got both sides printed, but I apologize for that. The back side on some of those copies did not get on there. Also, we talked a little bit about, I said we were going to get into more of design and science, those things this week, but I wanted to clear up also some questions that were brought up regarding fossils, and then also Joy told me that I didn't explain the Cambrian age very well. I just started talking about it, so I'm going to go over that a little bit before we move on. But first of all, I wanted to talk about the fossils that we mentioned through last couple weeks. But if you go to, I encourage everybody again, go to Apologetics Press, and you can type in their search engine there, have dinosaurs and human fossils been found together. If you type that up, there's a big article that comes up, and I don't want you to do it right now because I'm going to discuss some of the stuff that I got out of that article. But anyway, I encourage you to do that if you want to learn more about that question. But things to keep in mind, first of all, that fossils are very rare. It's not like you can go in your backyard and dig up and find a fossil. Fossils are very rare, and that's one thing to keep in mind. And not every plant, animal, or human fossilizes after death. Got to keep that in mind. Also, it is extremely rare for things once living to fossilize. If you remember a couple weeks ago when we discussed the process of fossilization, everything has to be a perfect situation for those things to happen. And then also, another thing that I thought was interesting, I didn't know this, not as many dinosaur fossils are out there that we think. There's not that many. So in October of 1990, Peter Dodson of the University of Pennsylvania, in the issue of Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, reported that 45.3% of all dinosaur genera are based on a single specimen. So that means almost half of the dinosaurs that we see pictures of are based on one specimen. 74% are represented by 5 or less specimens. So that, that's 3/4 of the dinosaurs that we see today that we have pictures of are based on 5 or less specimens. So it's not a very clear depiction of those dinosaurs. Some of the most famous replicas we have are based on only 10% of its remains. Example, the 120-foot long Argentinosaurus replica at the Fernbank Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. It had only a dozen backbone vertebrae, a few limb bones, and part of the hips. But yet we have a full 120-foot dinosaur replica. So that just kind of tells you that, kind of what Rich mentioned last week, that things would decay, that if they weren't in a perfect situation to fossilize, there would be some decay set in, or things would eat them, especially the animals that were still living in the sea. Another thing to look at, the fact that fossilization is extremely rare. Finding dinosaur and human fossils together would be similar to finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. So the fact that fossils are so rare, to find both of them together would even be that much more hard to do. All things that do fossilize, less than 1%, that's a huge number. Less than 1% are vertebrates, meaning fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, or mammals. Human fossils make up a microscopic part of the fossil record. So that just goes to tell us the question that Rich brought up, and then the different definitions that we have as far as the decay and other animals feeding on the humans and different dinosaurs. That was to answer that question that was brought up. BK, can you put up the slide, the geological column? So for me to explain the geological column, so if you look right here, you can't really see this, but this column represents the flood. And so you have these items right here that we're talking about. And if you remember when I talked about the flood, they call this the Cambrian explosion. Well, down here before the flood, which they predicted if there was a global flood, there would have been a time that there wasn't any fossils. Well, that's where we have right here the Precambrian. If you remember me discussing the Precambrian age. And if you look here, this is 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, 4,500 to 6,500 years ago. This flood process here, about a year. So I know that we talk in the Bible about 150 days, but if you remember when I discussed the Mount St. Helens explosion, that canyon formed and the things that happened into it took about 4 years. Like from 1980 when the explosion or when the volcano erupted, we had about 4 years, and then those things happened and then that canyon was developed. So that makes sense for that being about a year for all those things to take place. I'm good to go now. Uh-oh. Hot mic. Okay. Now I'm too loud probably. Anyway, so we had Albert Einstein with the general relativity. So he had that everything had to have a beginning, all time, all matter, and space. So we go over to Genesis, and I want us to think about that general relativity, the definition. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Does anybody see any connection there from what Albert Einstein found and then what we just read in those first two verses? Yep. So it has, in those verses that Albert Einstein is credited for finding out, in those verses we have general relativity. We have all time, matter, and space in just those two verses. So here we have an example of Scripture already defining general relativity. And what people have to keep in mind, we have, when we have discussions with atheists and evolutionists, they want to say, well, how come your God doesn't fall under this general relativity? Well, God is a spirit that we're told in the Bible. God transcends all time, matter, and space. God created general relativity. So we have this example that in the Scripture where it talks about this. So the law was shown at the beginning of creation, and so it had all time, matter, and space. Einstein was disappointed in his findings because he wanted the universe to be self-existent. So again, here we have another evolutionist, atheist, that wanted to prove that the universe was self-existent. He didn't want it to be a created space. He was so disappointed he created a cosmological constant to show the universe was static. So here we have him trying to create something to prove something that he had already proven, and so he's trying to disprove it. So his constant was later, in 1919, disproven by Arthur Eddington. Is that the name you were looking for a couple weeks ago? I got a couple more names, and maybe it'll be one of those. So Arthur Eddington, during a solar eclipse, he conducted an experiment which proved the general relativity to be true. The Earth wasn't static, but had a beginning. Eddington was also disappointed in his findings. He actually called them repugnant, and that he wished he could find a loophole. Again, we have another scientist that has come up with his process to disprove something that they're trying to prove, but they don't follow it. They just get mad and wish they hadn't have discovered it. So if we see this, I made a couple notes here. This reminds us of what we were talking about a few weeks ago, where Peter, when he was preaching and the people were pricked in their heart and they repented, and then later on we have Stephen, when he was preaching, the people were pricked in their heart, but they killed Stephen. So again, we have this example. These two men here, Albert Einstein and Arthur Eddington, again, they found the truth, but they hate it. And it's the same example. You either love it or you hate it. You're either going to follow it or not follow it. And that's what these men do. And it's just a living example that we see every day. People following this same path. Once they know the truth, they've got to decide, well, I'm going to follow the truth, or they're going to hate it because it's not conducive to the lifestyle that they want to live. Later on in 1922, a Russian mathematician, Alexander Friedman, is that him? It's not him. Alexander Friedman had officially exposed Einstein's constant as an algebraic error. In his quest to avoid a beginning, that's Albert Einstein, he divided by zero. You can't divide by zero, right? That's a mathematical law. So he found that to be true. So we have that, and here Albert Einstein is brilliant, and it's just, that's how far he went to try to disprove what his findings. Later, a Dutch astronomer, William de Sitter, found that general relativity required the universe to be expanding. And in 1927, the universe was observed to be expanding by astronomer Edwin Hubble. We talked about Edwin Hubble. That's a namesake for the Hubble Space Telescope. So in 1927, we have proof that the universe was expanding. Later in 1929, Einstein visited the location in California where the 100-inch telescope was to view the universe expanding. So this probably was hard for him to do because I'm sure Albert Einstein was a proud man. He admitted that he had made a mistake by saying that the universe was static. Einstein admitted he believed in a pantheistic God. What we went over that way at the beginning. Someone tell me what a pantheistic God is. Oh, Shane. God is the universe. He's everything, right? So that's what he claims that he believed in. But his comments about creation and divine thought better describe a theistic God. So he says he believes in a pantheistic God, but his definition of God more describes a theistic God. So now we have the cosmological argument. And I talked to Sharon, brought this up several weeks ago. I knew I'd be getting to this, so she'll probably remember this part. But this is the beginning of the end for atheists and evolutionists. It's the law of thermodynamics. Now, I'm paraphrasing this because I am not a scientist. I'm never claimed to be. So I'm going to paraphrase this law. So the first law of thermodynamics, and if someone's more knowledgeable about thermodynamics than me and can define it better, please speak up. So the first law, energy is always conserved. It cannot be created or destroyed. In essence, energy is constant. The second law basically states the universe is running out of energy. Energy supply is being used up, which shows the universe is not eternal. The third law states that the entropy, quantity representing the availability of a system's thermal energy for conversion into useful work of a system approaches a constant value as the temperature approaches absolute zero. So I don't understand the third one at all, and we're not going to be discussing that one, so we're going to be discussing the first and second law. So the first law, we have that the fact that the universe is running out of energy proves a beginning. So we have this law of thermodynamics disproving them right at the beginning, disproving the evolutionists and atheists right at the beginning. The first law stated that energy is constant. The universe only has so much energy. If the universe would have been running for all this time, it would have already been out of energy because it's already being used up. So think about so that would be how that would be happening. So it would be already out of energy. So the universe cannot be eternal based on the scientific law of thermodynamics. It had to be created, which is in line with the law of thermodynamics. So creation goes along with this scientific law. Arthur Eddington, again, English astronomer, physicist, and mathematician, was quoted in stating over 100 years ago, "If your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation." So here's a guy that doesn't believe in creation, and he just said that if what you believe in goes against the second law of thermodynamics, it can't stand on anything. So they're very confusing or confused. So anyway, those are the things that we had on the first and second law of thermodynamics. Any questions on that? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. So Sharon was stating that you can use that for the usable energy, that if you compare it to a log that's in a fire, it'll be burned up, and then the energy within that log is gone. It's no longer there. Another example I saw was about a car. You put gasoline in a car, the gasoline represents that same energy. Once it runs out of energy, the car doesn't run any longer. So you have two good examples of that. Any questions on the law of thermodynamics or any of the last few comments that were made? Nope? Okay. So the next part I want to go to, now this one, I like this title. It was in the book, so I wanted to use it. So this one's called From the Goo to You Via the Zoo. Thought that was pretty clever. So we're talking about macroevolution, the belief that all life forms have descended from a common ancestor. All this happened by natural processes without any intelligent intervention. Turn over to Genesis 1:28. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything living thing that moves on the earth." So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I don't know if you guys, I'm kind of a simple guy, so I kind of look at things. And when I'm talking to people that talk about we're all the same, and animals are animals, humans are part of the animals, and we're just like the monkeys and those type of things. Did you ever think about, obviously, if a lion came in here, I can't beat up a lion. I don't think anybody here could beat up a lion. But did you ever think why those animals don't try to come in here? Do you ever think about the separation that God has put between man and beast? And this scripture describes that. I mean, when you go out into the woods, most of the time, I know there's always some kind of a example where someone runs into an animal and gets eaten or whatever. But for the most part, animals are afraid of men. If you walk into the woods, I've seen videos where a grizzly bear is walking down the same trail and the people are coming the opposite way, and he turns around and takes off running. Why is that? Do you ever think about that? I always think about this verse when I read that. God made us we're to have dominion over all the animals. So that's just something to keep in mind when you think about if someone tries to tell you that, oh, well, you're just like those. Well, no, we're not. There's definitely a difference. So the theory of evolution by natural selection is the process of which organisms change over time as a result of changes in, because I'm getting ready to explain something, I want you to listen to this. Result of changes in heritable, physical, or behavioral traits. Changes that allow an organism to better adapt to its environment will help it survive and have more offspring. So again, I look at things on a simple basis. So Joy's dad, when he had a motorcycle accident a couple years ago, so there was 4 times that Joy had to decide whether he was going to live or die. Okay, but I watched this man when he had this accident. He had skull fractures, head trauma, broken ribs, broken shoulder, just a mess. His body filled up with fluid. He had fluid coming out of every pore of his skin. He was swollen to no end. How did his body know to do all that if evolution is true? Because what I just read, the definition, it's a heritable thing. So for everything that Gary's body went through, somewhere in his lineage, someone would have had to had a motorcycle wreck, hit his head in the same exact spot, have the same exact injuries. And I'm not talking about all at once. I'm saying it would have had to over and over again, because each step of his healing process had to have a step before it. So evolution doesn't even make sense when you look in medicine. Because when the body knows to heal itself, it wasn't because it learned it, it was created that way. And just so you know, all the fluid that was released in his body all at once, is a healing process that your body does. And I didn't know that. I'm asking the doctor, why is he, swollen and fluid coming out? He goes, your body, when it has traumatized, it releases all this fluid to help heal. It has all the medicinal purposes in that fluid. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Rich, our local paramedic here, was saying that all of our swelling, when we have an injury like a blister or something, that's a healing process that our body goes through. But I just wanted to mention that about Gary's accident, because I look at that and I think, well, that goes all against evolution. And I don't know why anybody hasn't, I've never heard that discussed before. Maybe you guys have discussed that with other people. Yes, sir. Right.
They think that, they have these skulls that have different mutations. In modern day genetics, they actually say
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, for millions of years, that's so unrealistic to just think that a million spontaneous little changes can make such drastic changes in individual beings.
Right.
It's just crazy.
Yeah, it is. And the point that you just made about the passing it on, so Gary went through that. He can't even pass it on to his kids. Like, so all that happened to Gary's done. He can't pass those healing processes, or if the body learned anything, it's done. He's not going to be able to pass that on. So, any other comments? Okay, so Darwinists call this natural selection, but the process of evolution is by definition without intelligence. There is no selection at all. Natural selection is survival of the fittest, which is what you were basically explaining, and I wasn't going to try to repeat that because I wouldn't have done you due diligence for everything you just said. So it's easier for me to read my little sentence. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about microevolution and macroevolution. So again, as Christians, we can't be afraid of the word evolution. And I like this lesson too, because when I was studying this in this book, I liked, if someone comes up to you, believe in evolution, you can say, you talking about macro or micro? And then that'll really throw them off, because then you're like, they're going, oh, well, wait a minute, this guy might know something. So anyway, microevolution, when bacteria is observed to mutate and survive an antibiotic, Darwinists want to call that macroevolution. Microevolution happens at a micro level. Notice the bacteria mutate, but they stay bacteria. They never change to another organism, i.e. what macroevolution says. So if a Darwinist asks you, be ready to say, I believe there's microevolution, but not macro. So don't be afraid of the word evolution, because there is evolution, there is evolutionary things that happen to us. So we had some, there's 5, sorry. Yeah. 5 things that I want to talk about regarding micro and macroevolution. First of all, genetic limits. Microevolution within its species, yes. Macroevolution across types, no. So we have the microevolution that will happen within that species. And then macroevolution is when it would change, from if it was a cat, then it become a dog. That's macro. That doesn't happen. The cyclical change. There are genetic limits to change within types, and the changes are cyclical. So you have an example of, has anybody ever heard of Darwin's finches? So Darwin's finches, they would have long beaks. They would have long beaks when it was dry out, because the seeds were harder and they needed longer beaks to eat. If the weather was wet and damp, they would have smaller beaks because the seeds were softer. Well, this is microevolution. Well, the Darwinists, they want to say that that's macro. So there's an example of the cyclical changes that we have. Bacteria does the same thing. We talked about that earlier. It mutates, but it's still the same bacteria. Louis Pasteur developed vaccines against fowl, cholera, anthrax, and rabies, the beginning of practicing immunization. So the whole immunization changes, or inventions for vaccines, those things are because they can kill that one strand of bacteria, and as a bacteria mutates, they can just adjust the vaccine to still kill that bacteria. But it doesn't change into another organism. It's still a form of that bacteria. Then we have irreducible complexity. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed," let me read that again. "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Again, we have Darwin himself discounting his own theory if what he said is true. So, but now, with science that we now know that there are many organs, systems, and processes in life that fit this description. One of those we talked about a few weeks ago, the cell. In Darwin's day, you couldn't see inside the cell. to know its makeup. Remember, we had the molecular science that came into effect, and I even mentioned that I wonder if Darwin would have still followed his theory if he had seen the cell today. So the cell, the molecular level of the cell, is far more complex than Darwin ever dreamed of. Michael Behe, professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, wrote a revolutionary book called Darwin's Black Box. Do you guys remember that? Did you guys? I had it in Science. I thought maybe you guys had. So, referring to the cell in Darwin's day, he found that living things are literally filled with molecular machines that perform the numerous functions of life. So think of a car with all the different functions in the motor, but the cell is a lot more complex than the motor of a car. Okay? DNA's genetic alphabet consists of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. With each human cell, there are about 3,000 sets of 1 million pairs of those letters in a cell. Okay, and think about all the information that I just talked about that's in one cell. And then the final note about that part, there is no publication in science, literature, journals, or books that describes how molecular evolution of any real complex biochemical system either did occur or even might have occurred. There's nothing out there. They have no explanation for it. There's none known in the science world. Okay, Rich mentioned this a couple weeks ago. We talked about it, but non-viable of transitional forms. There isn't any evidence of transitional forms. It is also evident that transitional life forms couldn't survive in this transitional form. So you have the example, I think we talked about the reptile transitioning into a bird. First indicates it would have feathers and half scales. It couldn't fly. It couldn't function as a reptile. It would be highly exposed to prey, and it wouldn't be adept to finding appropriate food. Another thing that Lance just mentioned about the skulls. If you look up a cartoon of the evolution of man, and I didn't know this now, but from ape to man, that you guys all remember that picture, it shows the monkey and then he grows into a man, is now considered a joke even among the science world. They know that that didn't happen. So when you see that, it's now, if you can go, don't do it now, Rich, you can Google that, and it actually says that it's not even accountable in the science world. They don't even look at it as evidence. Molecular isolation. Consider Darwin's theory of the similarity between the ape and the man. Some say the DNA similarity is 85 to 90%. Darwinists could be right. We could have all descended from a common ancestor. So we've got to consider that. But Darwinists could be wrong also. Perhaps the common genetic code is because we have a common creator who designed every living creature to survive in the same biosphere. If every creature had a distinct chemistry, a food chain could not exist. So if we all had a different chemical makeup, the food chain wouldn't even function. So we couldn't even survive as the animal kingdom, humankind, couldn't even survive. It wouldn't even work. See, I told you he was looking stuff up. Yeah, but the information I got, it's 80, it's 80 per 85. Yeah.
That 1% is so, that DNA is so vast that it'd be impossible to breed the chimpanzee with 99%.
Yeah.
And that even our chromosomes are the same. We have chimpanzee chromosomes that are end-to-end matched, and they still can't. There's still no way to manipulate it enough to even remotely be possible. That's a slight difference in frequency. Human is so vastly different, and basically, so advanced that there's no way to do that. And
Yeah.
how other animals can,
Yeah.
but they still come out sterile.
Where did you look that up at? What's that under?
Just science.com or science focus.
Yeah, go to Apologetics Press and the percentages will be off.
But even at that point, even 99%, though, you still can't even breed.
Yeah, but I don't even want to give them 99% when it says 85.
Well, the point I'm trying to make
You know what I'm saying?
is even that close,
Yeah.
they said the difference, that 1% is so vast.
Yeah.
That we still couldn't even come from that.
So he's saying 1%, and since it's 15%, it's really vast. Just so everything's good.
It talks about how even though the animals can
Yeah.
not sterile which totally blocks evolution because they still want them sterile.
Right. So, conclusion of what we just talked about. The 5 lines of evidence show that natural selection could not have produced new life forms. All right, I think that is it. Right at 8 o'clock.